The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Cedar Valley like a shroud, masking the shame that would unfold in the town square before noon. It was 1887, and the unforgiving territories of Montana had little patience for the broken dreams of those who dared to call it home. The land demanded everything and promised nothing in return, leaving behind a trail of widows, orphans, and souls too stubborn to surrender. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Sullivan stood at the cracked mirror in her boarding house room, her reflection fractured into pieces that seemed to mock her very existence. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now hung in limp strands around a face that had aged decades in the span of 3 years. The wedding dress she wore, if it could still be called, that had yellowed at the edges and bore the stains of too many desperate attempts to make it presentable. It had belonged to her mother, then to her sister, and now to her, the last Sullivan woman who would ever wear it. Her fingers trembled as she fastened the tiny pearl buttons that ran from her collar to her waist. Each button was a memory, a reminder of the life she had planned but would never live. Dr. Harrison had been clear about her condition, delivering the diagnosis with the clinical detachment that came so naturally to men of medicine. Barren, he had said, the word falling between them like a stone dropped into still water. I'm afraid motherhood will never be in your future, Miss Sullivan. That single word had destroyed everything. Her engagement to Thomas Fletcher, the banker's son, had ended within the week. Her teaching position at the local schoolhouse had been quietly terminated. What use was a woman who couldn't fulfill her natural purpose? Her small inheritance had dwindled to nothing as she struggled to maintain appearances in a society that had already written her off as damaged goods. The boarding house room she occupied was barely larger than a closet, with walls so thin she could hear Mrs. Henley snoring from the adjacent room and the constant scurrying of mice in the walls. A single window looked out onto the alley where the town's refuse accumulated in piles that grew taller with each passing day. The smell of decay and human desperation seeped through the glass, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. Margaret's hands moved to the small leather trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. A few threadbare dresses, her mother's Bible with its worn leather cover, a silver locket that had been her grandmother's, and the letter that had brought her to this moment. The letter from the matrimonial agency, with its flowery promises of new beginnings and loving homes, had arrived 3 weeks ago like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Dear Miss Sullivan, it read in elegant script, we have received your inquiry regarding our specialized placement services. While your circumstances present certain challenges, we believe there may be suitable arrangements available for a woman of your refinement and education. Please report to the town square of Millbrook on Saturday morning for our quarterly selection event. Selection event. The euphemism made her stomach turn. But what choice did she have? The boarding housekeeper, Mrs. Pettigrew, had already informed her that payment was due in full by week's end, and Margaret's purse contained exactly 17 cents and a brass button that had fallen from her coat. The town of Millbrook sprawled across the valley floor like a scab on the earth's surface, built around the timber mill that gave it its name. The settlement had grown haphazardly as men chased the promise of work and wealth. The buildings were mostly rough-hewn wood and corrugated metal, functional structures that prioritized utility over beauty. The main street was a ribbon of mud and horse manure, lined with businesses that catered to the basic needs of working men. Saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, and the inevitable house of ill repute that operated behind the facade of a boarding house for working girls. The mill dominated the eastern edge of town, its massive wheel turning endlessly as it processed the trees that were stripped from the surrounding mountains. The sound of grinding metal and falling timber created a constant backdrop of industrial noise that spoke of progress and prosperity for some, while others barely scraped by in its shadow. Margaret had arrived in Millbrook 3 days earlier on the weekly stagecoach, her worldly possessions crammed into the single trunk that now sat at the foot of her narrow bed. The journey had been a nightmare of dust, cramped quarters, and the leering attention of male passengers who seemed to sense her desperation like wolves scenting wounded prey. She had spent those 3 days exploring the town, trying to understand the community that might become her home if she could find someone willing to overlook her fundamental flaw. The church stood at the center of town, its white-painted spire reaching toward heaven like an accusing finger. Reverend Morrison, a thin man with hollow cheeks and burning eyes, had made it clear during their brief meeting that the Lord's plan did not include women who could not fulfill their biblical mandate to be fruitful and multiply. His wife, a pinched woman with disapproving lines etched permanently around her mouth, had looked at Margaret as if she carried some contagious disease. The schoolhouse, a one-room building on the outskirts of town, was run by Miss Elizabeth Cooper, a spinster in her 40s who had never married and seemed determined to make everyone around her as miserable as she was. Margaret had inquired about teaching positions, only to be told that the community preferred their educators to be proper examples of Christian womanhood. The implication was clear. A barren woman could hardly serve as a role model for young girls who needed to learn their place in the natural order. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store with her husband, had been more sympathetic but equally pragmatic. "It's not that we don't feel for your situation, dear," she had explained while weighing out flour for another customer. "It's just that folks around here believe everything happens for a reason. If the good Lord didn't see fit to bless you with the capacity for children, well, there must be a purpose in that too." The purpose, it seemed, was to serve as a cautionary tale for other women who might be tempted to put their own desires above their duty, to populate the frontier with the next generation of Americans. Margaret had seen it in their eyes, the mixture of pity and revulsion that greeted her wherever she went. She was an anomaly, a woman without purpose in a world that defined female worth entirely by reproductive capacity. The other women staying at Mrs. Pettigrew's boarding house had been equally unwelcoming. Most were young girls from back east who had come west in search of husbands, their trunks filled with carefully preserved hope chests and their heads full of romantic notions about frontier life. They whispered among themselves about Margaret's situation, creating elaborate theories about what terrible sin she must have committed to deserve such divine punishment. Only Sarah McKenna, a widow from Ireland who worked as a seamstress, had shown her any kindness. Sarah's husband had died in a mining accident 2 years earlier, leaving her with no children and few prospects. But Sarah at least had the dignity of having been married, of having fulfilled her purpose however briefly. Margaret had not even been granted that small mercy. "The auction isn't as terrible as it sounds," Sarah had whispered to her the night before, as they sat in the boarding house parlor darning stockings by lamplight. "Some of the men are decent enough, just lonely. And the ones who show up to these things, well, they're not looking for perfection. They're looking for companionship, someone to cook and clean and warm their beds. Your ... condition ... might not matter as much as you think." But Margaret knew better. She had seen the handbills posted around town, advertising the matrimonial selection event in language that made it sound like a livestock auction. Because that's exactly what it was. Women with impediments to marriage, too old, too plain, too poor, or in her case, too broken, were put on display for men who couldn't attract wives through normal courtship. The desperate choosing from among the discarded, the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the true nature of the day ahead. From her window, Margaret could see the town square where wooden platforms were being erected by a crew of rough-looking men. Large banners hung from the buildings surrounding the square, their messages visible even from her second-story perch. "Find your perfect helpmate," "Quality women seeking good homes," and most prominently, "All sales final." Mrs. Pettigrew had knocked on her door an hour earlier, her weathered face bearing the expression of someone delivering news of a death in the family. "Time to get ready, dear," she had said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "The agency representative will be here soon to collect you and the others." The others. Margaret had met them over the past few days, collection of society's unwanted women who had reached the end of their options. There was Helen Morrison, no relation to the Reverend, who at 38 was considered past her prime despite being attractive and accomplished. She had been a governess for wealthy families back east until a scandal involving her employer's eldest son had made her unemployable in respectable households. Then there was Clara Webb, a farmer's daughter from Ohio whose face bore the purple remnants of bruises that told their own story about why she needed to escape her current situation. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in whispers that suggested someone had spent considerable effort convincing her that her voice didn't matter. Josephine Butler represented perhaps the saddest case of all, a former opera singer whose voice had been destroyed by illness, leaving her without the talent that had been her sole claim to fame. She was still beautiful, but beauty without purpose was another kind of curse in a world that demanded women justify their existence. And finally, there was Rebecca Foster, whose crime had been falling in love with the wrong man. She had been caught in a compromising position with her employer's married son, branded as a homewrecker despite being the victim of his persistent advances. Her reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that even her own family had disowned her. Each woman carried her own burden of shame and disappointment, but Margaret knew that her mark of inadequacy cut deeper than the others. Their sins were moral failings that could potentially be overlooked or forgiven. Her barrenness was a fundamental flaw written into her very being, as permanent and damning as a scarlet letter, burned into her flesh. The sound of wheels on cobblestone announced the arrival of the agency wagon. Margaret gathered her few belongings, pinned her mother's cameo brooch to her dress as a small gesture of defiance, and prepared to face whatever lay ahead. As she walked down the narrow stairs of the boarding house, each step felt like a small death, a surrender of the life she had planned for the unknown future that awaited her in the town square. Mrs. Pettigrew stood by the front door, her expression unreadable. "I've seen worse matches work out," she said quietly, pressing a small paper-wrapped bundle into Margaret's hands. "Some bread and cheese for the journey, wherever it may lead." The gesture of kindness nearly broke Margaret's composure, but she managed to maintain her dignity as she stepped out into the harsh morning light. The wagon waited in the street, its bed lined with rough benches and already occupied by the other women who would share her fate. Their faces reflected the same mixture of terror and resignation that she felt in her own heart. As the wagon lurched into motion, carrying them toward an uncertain future, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the window of a storefront. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, hollow-eyed, worn down by disappointment, but still clinging to some indefinable spark of hope. Perhaps Sarah was right. Perhaps there was a man somewhere in that crowd who would look past her brokenness and see something worth saving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wagon rolled through the streets of Millbrook toward the town square, where her new life would begin with the fall of an auctioneer's hammer. The town square of Millbrook had transformed into something resembling a medieval marketplace, complete with the carnival atmosphere that accompanied any public spectacle. Wooden platforms had been erected in the center, each one positioned to give the growing crowd the best possible view of the proceedings. Colorful bunting hung between the buildings, a grotesque attempt to dress up what everyone knew was essentially a human livestock auction. Margaret felt her stomach lurch as the wagon came to a stop near the staging area. The other women sat in stunned silence, their faces pale as they took in the scene before them. A crowd of perhaps 200 people had gathered, though it was clear that the actual bidders represented only a fraction of that number. The rest were spectators drawn by the novelty of the event, families who had come to town for supplies and stayed for the entertainment. Mr. Augustus Whitmore, the matrimonial agency representative, appeared beside the wagon like a well-dressed vulture. He was a portly man in his 50s, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed absurdly formal for the frontier setting. His silver hair was slicked back with pomade, and his handlebar mustache was waxed to perfection. Everything about him spoke of Eastern refinement and barely concealed contempt for the rough surroundings he found himself in. Ladies, he announced in a voice trained to carry across rooms filled with wealthy patrons. Welcome to what I assure you will be the beginning of new and fulfilling chapters in your lives. Now please remember the instructions we discussed. Stand straight, smile pleasantly, and answer all questions honestly. Deception at this stage serves no one's interests. Margaret climbed down from the wagon on legs that felt like water, her hand gripping the side rail so tightly her knuckles went white. The crowd's attention focused on their small group immediately, and she could feel dozens of eyes examining her like she was a horse being evaluated for purchase. Comments drifted across the square, spoken just loudly enough to be heard. That red-haired one's got some fire in her, I'd wager. Look at the way the tall one holds herself, probably thinks she's too good for honest work. My money's on the blonde in the blue dress. She's got breeding, that one. A makeshift registration table had been set up near the platform, where Whitmore began arranging papers and consulting a leather-bound ledger. Each woman would be presented individually, with Whitmore reading from prepared cards that summarized their backgrounds, skills, and any particular circumstances potential bidders should know about. Helen Morrison was called first, her previous experience as a governess making her the most obviously marketable of the group. She climbed the platform steps with dignity intact, her chin raised despite the humiliation of her circumstances. Whitmore's introduction was relatively kind, emphasizing her education and refinement while glossing over the scandal that had brought her to this point. The bidding was spirited but not enthusiastic. A cattle rancher named Peterson secured Helen for $47, a respectable sum that drew approving nods from the crowd. Helen's relief was visible as she stepped down from the platform to meet her new husband, a man who appeared decent enough despite the unconventional nature of their introduction. Clara Webb followed, her obvious terror making the experience painful to watch. Her history as a victim of domestic violence had been carefully reframed as seeking a fresh start in supportive circumstances, but her nervous trembling spoke volumes about her past experiences. A middle-aged shopkeeper named Murphy placed the winning bid of $32, his kind eyes suggesting he might provide the safety Clara desperately needed. Josephine Butler's presentation focused on her refined manners and musical background, though Whitmore was careful not to mention the loss of her voice. The bidding reached $51 before a prosperous-looking businessman from the territorial capital claimed her as his bride. Rebecca Foster's auction proved more challenging. Her beauty worked in her favor, but whispers about her moral flexibility kept the serious bidders at bay. Eventually, a grizzled prospector named Jackson placed a winning bid of $28, his gap-toothed grin suggesting his intentions were less than honorable. Then it was Margaret's turn. She climbed the wooden steps feeling like she was ascending a gallows. The platform felt unsteady beneath her feet, though she knew the sensation was more likely her own nerves than any structural deficiency. The crowd spread out before her like a sea of judgmental faces, each one evaluating her worth with the cold calculation of livestock buyers. Whitmore cleared his throat dramatically, consulting the card that would seal her fate. Gentlemen, I present Miss Margaret Sullivan of Cedar Valley. 26 years of age, educated, with experience in teaching and household management. She comes from a respectable family and possesses all the refinements one would expect from a woman of good breeding. A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Margaret's education and relative youth worked in her favor, and several men in the front rows leaned forward with apparent interest. She allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps her condition wouldn't matter as much as she had feared. Then Whitmore continued reading from his card, his voice taking on the apologetic tone reserved for damaged goods. However, I must inform potential bidders that Miss Sullivan has been examined by medical professionals and found to be reproductively challenged. While she would make an excellent companion and household manager, those seeking to expand their families should direct their attention elsewhere. The effect was immediate and devastating. The interested expressions vanished, replaced by the kind of revulsion typically reserved for diseased livestock. Men who had been leaning forward settled back in their chairs, their attention already shifting to other prospects. Conversations broke out across the crowd as Margaret's fundamental flaw became the primary topic of discussion. Barren as a salt flat then. What's the point of taking a wife who can't give you sons? Might as well marry a broodmare with a broken leg. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame as the crowd's initial interest curdled into disdain. She stood frozen on the platform, watching her worst fears play out in real time. The silence stretched on as Whitmore waited for opening bids that weren't coming. "Come now, gentlemen," Whitmore called out with forced enthusiasm. "Miss Sullivan offers many valuable qualities beyond mere childbearing. Her education alone makes her worth consideration, and her refined upbringing would be an asset to any household seeking to improve its social standing." Still silence. Margaret could see pity in some faces, disgust in others, but nowhere did she see the spark of genuine interest that might translate into a bid. She began to contemplate the very real possibility that she would leave the platform unclaimed, destined for whatever grim fate awaited women who failed to attract even a single offer, just as Whitmore raised his gavel to declare the lot withdrawn. A voice cut through the uncomfortable quiet. "What's the starting bid?" Every head in the crowd turned to locate the speaker. Margaret's eyes followed the collective gaze to a man standing near the back of the assembled crowd, partially hidden in the shadow of a merchant's wagon. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of hard work rather than prosperity. Everything about him suggested a working man rather than a gentleman of leisure. Whitmore seemed surprised by the interruption, but quickly recovered his professional composure. "The opening bid is set at $15, sir. Are you prepared to make such an offer?" The man stepped forward, moving through the crowd with a confidence that suggested he was accustomed to being noticed. As he came into clearer view, Margaret could see that he was perhaps 35 years old, with weathered hands and the kind of deep tan that came from spending long hours in the sun. His face was pleasant enough, though marked by lines that spoke of either frequent laughter or persistent worry. $15, he called out clearly, his voice carrying easily across the square. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. The bid was respectable enough, though hardly enthusiastic. Whitmore looked around hopefully for competing offers, but the other men remained steadfastly uninterested in a wife who couldn't provide them with heirs. $15 from the gentleman in the back, Whitmore announced. "Do I hear 20? $20 for this refined and educated young lady?" The silence stretched on, broken only by the restless shuffling of feet and the distant sound of the sawmill. Margaret found herself staring at her unexpected bidder, trying to read something in his expression that might hint at his motivations. He didn't look like a man driven by desperation or base desires. If anything, his demeanor suggested careful consideration rather than impulse. "Going once at $15, Whitmore called out, his voice taking on the ritualistic cadence of auctioneers everywhere. "Going twice... Margaret held her breath, uncertain whether she should hope for competing bids or fear them. The man who had spoken for her remained steady and calm, showing no signs of anxiety about potentially winning his bid. "Sold to the gentleman for $15. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the entire square. Margaret felt a strange combination of relief and terror wash over her. She had been claimed, saved from the ultimate humiliation of going unwanted, but by a complete stranger whose motivations remained entirely mysterious. The crowd began to disperse now that the main entertainment was concluded, though many lingered to get a better look at the matches that had been made. Margaret climbed down from the platform on unsteady legs, her mind reeling from the rapid change in her circumstances. Her buyer, she couldn't yet think of him, as her husband approached the registration table where Whitmore was completing the necessary paperwork. Up close, Margaret could see that his clothes, while well worn, were clean and carefully mended. His boots were scuffed but well maintained, and his hands, though calloused, were clean. Everything about him suggested a man who took pride in his appearance despite limited means. "That'll be $15, mister," Whitmore prompted, his pen poised over the marriage certificate. "Brennan." "Daniel Brennan," the man replied, reaching into his jacket to retrieve a worn leather wallet. "And I'll need to make some additions to that certificate." Whitmore looked up with interest. "Additions? I'm afraid the terms are quite standard, Mr. Brennan. What modifications did you have in mind?" Daniel Brennan counted out $15 in mixed bills and coins, placing them carefully on the table before answering. "The certificate needs to reflect that Margaret Sullivan is becoming mother to 8 children, not just wife to one man." The statement hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as everyone within earshot tried to process what they had just heard. Margaret felt her knees go weak as the implications sank in. This man, this stranger who had just purchased her like a piece of farm equipment, was a widower with 8 children. Whitmore's pen froze above the paper. "8 children, you said? My goodness, Mr. Brennan, that's quite a household you're taking Miss Sullivan into. Are you certain she's prepared for such responsibility?" Before Daniel could answer, Margaret found her voice. "8 children?" she repeated, her words barely above a whisper. "You have 8 children?" Daniel turned to face her directly for the first time since making his bid. His eyes were a warm brown, and when he looked at her, she saw none of the pity or disgust that had marked the other faces in the crowd. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like understanding. "8 children who need a mother," he said simply. "And from what I heard up there, you're a woman who was meant to be one, regardless of what any doctor might have told you." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but not one delivered in cruelty. For the first time since receiving her devastating diagnosis, someone was suggesting that her worth wasn't defined by her ability to bear children. Someone was looking at her broken places and seeing possibility instead of failure. "I don't understand," she managed to say, her voice shaking. "You heard what Mr. Whitmore said about my condition. Why would you want—" "Ma'am," Daniel interrupted gently, "with respect, I think you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't why I'd want you. The question is whether you'd want us." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama in the exchange. Margaret was dimly aware of the attention, but her focus had narrowed to the man standing before her with his impossible offer. 8 children. A ready-made family for a woman who had been told she could never have one. "Tell me about them," she said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. "Your children. Tell me about them." Daniel's face softened, and for the first time since she'd seen him, he smiled. It was a tired smile, marked by exhaustion and worry, but genuine nonetheless. "Well, there's Michael, he's 15, and thinks he's man enough to run the place. Then there's Patrick, he's 13, and has more energy than a team of horses. The twins, Sean and Shannon, are 11, and they're either the best of friends or the worst of enemies depending on the day." He paused, his expression growing more tender. "Katie's 9, and she's been trying to mother the younger ones since their real mother died. Little Bridget is 7. and she's got a voice that could wake the dead when she sets her mind to it. Timothy's 5 and he follows me around like a lost puppy. And then there's baby Molly." "Baby Molly?" Margaret repeated. "She's 2, Daniel said quietly. "She doesn't remember her mother at all. None of them have had a woman's touch in over a year now, and Katie ... Katie's too young to carry that burden, but she tries anyway." Margaret felt tears threatening to spill over. The picture he painted was overwhelming. 8 children, all of them dealing with the loss of their mother, all of them hungry for the kind of nurturing she had always dreamed of providing. It was everything she had wanted and everything she had been told she could never have. "Why me?" she asked. "Surely there were other women here today who could give you more. Women who could give you more children of your own." Daniel shook his head firmly. "I've got 8 children already, Miss Sullivan. What I need isn't more babies. What I need is someone who can love the ones I've got like they were her own. Someone who won't see them as obstacles to overcome, but as gifts to treasure." He gestured toward the dispersing crowd where the other successful bidders were leading their new wives away. Those men were looking for broodmares, not mothers. You heard them talking. They want young wives who can give them sons to carry on their names. That's not what my children need. Margaret looked around the square, seeing it with new eyes. The other women had been chosen for their potential to produce new life. She had been chosen for her capacity to nurture existing life. The distinction was profound and filled her with a sensation she had almost forgotten. Hope. Whitmore cleared his throat impatiently. "If we could complete the paperwork, please. I have other business to attend to this afternoon." Daniel turned back to the registration table, but Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "Mr. Brennan, ... Nil. I need to know something." He looked at her expectantly. "Are you looking for a wife, or are you looking for a governess you don't have to pay?" The question was bold, perhaps even rude, but Margaret needed to understand exactly what she was agreeing to. Daniel's answer would determine whether she was stepping into a marriage or simply another form of servitude. Daniel considered her question seriously before answering. "I won't lie to you, Miss Sullivan. My children's needs come first. They've been through enough heartbreak, and I won't bring anyone into our home who might cause them more pain. But if you're asking whether I'm looking for a partner or just hired help, I'm hoping for a partner. Someone who can help me build something good for all of us." Margaret studied his face, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives. What she saw instead was exhaustion, hope, and a deep well of love for the children he was trying to protect and provide for. This was a man who had been carrying an impossible burden alone and was offering to share it with her. "Then yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll come home with you. I'll be mother to your 8 children, and we'll see what kind of family we can build together." Daniel's relief was visible, though he tried to maintain his composure. "Thank you, Margaret. I think this might work out better than either of us expected." As Whitmore completed the marriage certificate with flourishing strokes of his pen, Margaret felt the weight of her old life falling away. The woman who had climbed onto that platform broken, worthless, defined by what she couldn't do, was being replaced by someone new. Someone who might actually matter to 8 children who needed her. The certificate was signed, witnessed, and sealed. In the eyes of the law and the community, Margaret Sullivan was now Margaret Brennan, wife to Daniel and mother to Michael, Patrick, Sean, Shannon, Katie, Bridget, Timothy, and Molly. As they walked away from the town square together, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that her story might have a happy ending after all. The wagon that would carry Margaret to her new life was nothing like the agency's polished transport that had brought her to the auction. Daniel's vehicle was a practical farm wagon, its wooden bed scarred by years of hauling everything from feed sacks to fence posts. The 2 draft horses that pulled it were sturdy animals with intelligent eyes and well-groomed coats, that spoke of careful attention. Despite their owner's modest circumstances, Margaret climbed onto the bench seat beside Daniel, her small trunk. Secured in the back, alongside what appeared to be supplies for the journey home. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, and she realized with a start that they would be traveling into unfamiliar territory as darkness fell. Everything about her situation felt surreal less than 6 hours ago. She had been a desperate woman facing an uncertain future, and now she was a married woman traveling toward a home filled with 8 children she had never met. "How far is your farm?" she asked, as Daniel clicked his tongue to set the horses in motion. The question seemed mundane, but she needed to fill the silence with something concrete, something that might help her process the magnitude of what had just occurred. "About 3 hours by wagon," Daniel replied, his hand steady on the reins. "We're up in the mountain valley, about 10 miles north of here. Good water, decent soil, though the winters can be harsh. The children are probably watching for us from the ridge about now." The thought of 8 young faces pressed against windows, waiting for their father to return with the stranger who would become their new mother, sent a flutter of panic through Margaret's chest. "What have you told them about me, about today?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I told them I was going to town to find someone who might want to be part of our family. I didn't want to get their hopes up in case ... double quotes." He glanced at her briefly. "In case things didn't work out the way I hoped they would." "And what exactly did you hope would happen?" Margaret asked. The question had been building in her mind since the moment he'd placed his bid. "You must have known about my condition before you bid." Mr. Whitmore wasn't exactly subtle in his announcement. "I heard what he said," Daniel confirmed. "But I also heard the way you carried yourself up there, even when those people were saying cruel things. That takes strength, and strength is what my children need more than anything else right now." The road began to climb gradually as they left the valley floor behind. Pine trees crowded close to the trail, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the declining sunlight into dancing patterns of gold and shadow. The air grew cooler and carried the clean scent of mountain water and growing things. "Tell me more about them," Margaret said. "Your children. I need to know what I'm walking into." Daniel's expression softened as it had before when speaking of his family. "Michael's the oldest at 15. He's been trying to be the man of the house since his mother died, and it's been hard on him. Takes everything too seriously, works too hard, doesn't laugh enough anymore. He might be the most challenging for you. He's protective of the younger ones and suspicious of anyone new." Margaret nodded, filing away this crucial information. A teenage boy who had been forced to grow up too quickly would naturally resent anyone who threatened his position as protector of his siblings. Patrick's 13, and he's Michael's opposite in almost every way. Where Michael broods, Patrick explodes. He's all energy and impulse, always getting into scrapes but never meaning any real harm. He's the one who's been getting into the most trouble since we lost their mother." "What kind of trouble?" Margaret asked, sensing this might be important. "Fighting mostly. At school, in town. He's angry about losing his mother, and he takes it out on anyone who looks at him wrong. The schoolmaster threatened to expel him more than once." Margaret made a mental note that Patrick would need careful handling, a combination of firm boundaries and understanding that his anger came from grief rather than malice. The twins, Sean and Shannon, are 11. Sean's quiet and thoughtful, loves books when he can get his hands on them. Shannon's more outgoing, always asking questions about everything. They're as close as any twins I've ever seen, but they've been having nightmares since their mother died. "Nightmares?" "They were the ones who found her," Daniel said quietly. "She collapsed in the kitchen while making breakfast. The twins came down early and, well, it's been hard for them to sleep easy since then." Margaret felt her heart clench at the image of 2 11-year-old children discovering their mother's lifeless body. The trauma of that moment would leave scars that might take years to heal. Katie's 9, and she's been trying to mother everyone else. She does the cooking now, what little we manage, and she tries to keep the little ones clean and fed. She's growing up too fast, just like Michael, but she won't let anyone help her. Says it's her job now. The picture of a 9-year-old girl, shouldering responsibilities that would challenge a grown woman maid. Margaret's chest tight with sympathy and determination. Katie would need to learn that she could be a child again, that someone else was willing to carry the burden she had taken on. Bridget's 7, and she's our little firecracker. Red hair like yours actually, and a temper to match when she's crossed. She's been having the hardest time understanding why her mother isn't coming back. Keeps asking when Mama's going to be done being dead. Margaret had to bite her lip to keep from crying at that innocent question. A 7-year-old's understanding of death was limited at best, and the confusion and hope in such a question spoke volumes about the child's ongoing pain. Timothy's 5, and he follows me everywhere I go. Won't let me out of his sight if he can help it. I think he's afraid that if I leave, I might not come back either. He's stopped talking much since his mother died, used to chatter constantly, but now he just watches and listens. A 5-year-old dealing with separation anxiety and selective mutism would need patience and consistency to feel secure. Again, Margaret found herself already thinking about ways to help Timothy feel safe while gradually encouraging him to express himself. And baby Molly is too. She's the only one who doesn't really understand what happened. She still looks for her mother sometimes, toddles around the house calling Mama and getting confused when no one answers. In some ways, she's the easiest because she doesn't carry the same grief as the others. But she's also the hardest because she needs so much care, and none of us really know how to give it to her properly. Margaret absorbed this information, building mental pictures of each child and their individual needs. 8 young people, all dealing with profound loss in their own ways, all looking to their father for stability and answers he might not have. And now they would be looking at her as well. Their mother, Margaret said carefully. What was she like? Daniel was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of loss that had been carefully controlled until now. She was everything I wasn't. Patient where I was rushed, gentle where I was rough around the edges. She could calm any crying baby, settle any argument between the children, make any house feel like a home. She sang while she worked, and the whole place felt lighter when she was in it. Margaret felt a stab of inadequacy. How could she possibly fill the shoes of a woman who sounded like the perfect mother and wife? You must miss her terribly. Every day, Daniel admitted. But missing her and needing her are two different things. I miss Catherine the woman, my wife, the mother of my children. But what we need now is someone who can help us build something new. Someone who can love those children, not because they're Catherine's, but because they're worth loving for themselves. The distinction was important, and Margaret felt some of her anxiety ease. Daniel wasn't looking for a replacement for his deceased wife. He was looking for someone who could help his family move forward into a different kind of future. I should tell you, Margaret said, I don't have much experience with children. I taught school for a few years, but that's very different from being a mother. I might not know what I'm doing, especially at first. None of us know what we're doing, Daniel replied with a rueful smile. Catherine and we learned as we went along. Made plenty of mistakes, but we figured it out together. I'm hoping we can do the same, you and me and the children. The road had grown steeper, winding through dense forest where the shadows were deep and cool. Occasionally, they passed clearings where other homesteads were carved out of the wilderness, small islands of civilization in an ocean of untamed land. Each farm told a story of determination and hard work, of families trying to build something permanent in a landscape that seemed determined to reclaim every human achievement. What do you grow on your land? Margaret asked, trying to understand the practical aspects of her new life. Hey, mostly some wheat and corn. We keep cattle, dairy cows, pigs, chickens. It's not a big operation, but it keeps us fed and provides enough extra to trade in town for what we can't make ourselves. The children all have their chores. Even little Timothy has jobs he can handle. Margaret nodded, mentally adding livestock, care and farming knowledge to the list of skills she would need to acquire quickly. Her education had focused on literature and mathematics, not practical homesteading, but she was determined to learn whatever was necessary to contribute to the family's welfare. The house, she said hesitantly. Is there room for everyone? 8 children, and now. She gestured at herself, uncertain how to phrase the question. It's not fancy, but it's solid, Daniel assured her. 4 bedrooms upstairs, kitchen, and parlor downstairs. The boys share 2 rooms, the girls share 1, and there's a small room that was mine and Catherine's. I've been sleeping in the barn loft since she died, couldn't bear to. Well, anyway, that room is yours now if you want it. The arrangement solved the immediate practical problem of sleeping accommodations, but it also highlighted the unusual nature of their marriage. They were legally wed, but they were essentially strangers who would be sharing a home and children without the foundation of courtship or affection that typically preceded such arrangements. Daniel, Margaret said carefully, we should probably discuss what you expect from this marriage. Beyond caring for the children, I mean. Daniel's hands tightened slightly on the reins, and Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. I expect honesty, he said finally. I expect you to treat my children with kindness and fairness. I expect you to pull your weight around the farm and not consider yourself above any task that needs doing. He paused, seeming to struggle with how to address the more delicate aspects of their arrangement. As for the other things that married couples usually, I mean the more personal aspects of marriage, I think we should let those develop naturally, if they develop at all. I'm not looking for someone to warm my bed out of obligation. If something more than partnership grows between us over time, well, we can address that when it happens. Margaret felt a wave of relief at his reasonable approach. The prospect of immediate physical intimacy with a virtual stranger had been one of her greatest fears about the matrimonial auction. Daniel's willingness to let their relationship develop organically suggested a sensitivity she hadn't dared hope for. Thank you, she said simply. That means more to me than you probably realize. The road crested a ridge, and Daniel pointed ahead to where smoke was rising from a chimney in the distance. There, he said. That's home. Margaret's first glimpse of the Brennan farm was of a substantial 2-story house nestled in a natural clearing, surrounded by outbuildings and fields that stretched toward the mountains on all sides. It was larger than she had expected, though clearly built for function rather than beauty. The barn was enormous, suggesting a serious farming operation, and she could see cattle dotting the distant pastures. It's bigger than I imagined, she admitted. Had to be with so many children, Daniel explained. Catherine and I always planned on a large family. We just didn't expect. He didn't finish the thought, but Margaret understood. They had planned for many children, but expected to raise them together. As the wagon drew closer, Margaret could see figures emerging from the house and gathering on the front porch. 8 children, ranging from what appeared to be a tall teenager down to a toddler being held by one of the older girls. They stood in a line, watching the approaching wagon with expressions she couldn't read from a distance. Are you ready for this? Daniel asked, and Margaret could hear the nervousness in his voice. This moment was as crucial for him as it was for her. If the children rejected her, if this arrangement failed, he would be back where he started with 8 grieving children and no one to help him care for them. Margaret straightened her shoulders and smoothed her skirt, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. I'm ready, she said. Though her heart was hammering against her ribs, the wagon rolled into the farmyard, and Margaret could now see the children's faces clearly. The oldest boy, Michael, she reminded herself, stood slightly apart from the others, his arms crossed and his expression guarded. The 13-year-old, who must be Patrick, was practically bouncing with curiosity, craning his neck to get a better look at her. The twins stood hand in hand, their identical faces solemn and watchful. A girl with dark hair who could only be 9-year-old. Katie held the toddler Molly, while a red-haired girl of about 7 peered out from behind her older sister's skirts. A small boy with Daniel's dark hair clung to Katie's free hand, his thumb in his mouth as he stared at the stranger their father had brought home. Daniel brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down, then moved around to help Margaret descend. As her feet touched the ground, she found herself face to face with 8 pairs of eyes, all evaluating the woman who was supposed to become their new mother. The silence stretched on, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the distant lowing of cattle. Margaret realized that everyone was waiting for her to make the first move, to say something that would set the tone for everything that followed. She looked at each child in turn, trying to match faces to the names and descriptions Daniel had provided during their journey. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite her nervousness. "Hello," she said simply. "I'm Margaret, and I'm very pleased to meet all of you. Your father has told me wonderful things about each one of you, and I'm hoping we can become a family together." It was Michael who spoke first, his voice carrying an edge of challenge that confirmed Daniel's assessment of his protective instincts. "What makes you think you can replace our mother?" The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Margaret could see Daniel tense, ready to intervene, but she held up a hand to stop him. This was her test to pass, not his. "I don't think I can replace your mother," she said honestly, meeting Michael's hostile gaze directly. "I wouldn't want to, even if I could. Your mother was special to all of you, and nobody could ever take her place. I'm not here to replace her. I'm here to be something new. To be Margaret, who wants to take care of you and love you and help your father keep this family together." Michael's expression softened slightly, though his stance remained guarded. "And what if we don't want you here?" "Then I'll try to earn your trust," Margaret replied. "I won't force myself on any of you, but I won't give up easily either. I think we all deserve a chance to see if we can make this work." Katie stepped forward, still holding Molly, and Margaret could see the weight of premature responsibility in the young girl's shoulders. "Can you cook?" she asked practically. "I can learn," Margaret said. "I'm hoping you might teach me some of the things you've figured out." For the first time, Katie's serious expression cracked slightly. The idea of teaching an adult instead of carrying all the responsibility alone was clearly appealing. Patrick, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, blurted out, "Did Papa really buy you at an auction like a cow?" "Patrick." Daniel's voice carried a sharp rebuke, but Margaret held up her hand again. "It's a fair question," she said, looking at the energetic 13-year-old. "Yes, there was an auction, and yes, your father bid on me. But it wasn't like buying a cow. It was more like your father giving me a chance to prove that I could be part of this family, and me giving all of you a chance to see if you wanted me here." The explanation seemed to satisfy Patrick's curiosity, and Margaret could see some of the tension leaving the group. The twins were whispering to each other, and 7-year-old Bridget had emerged from behind Katie's skirts to get a better look at the woman with hair that matched her own. Baby Molly, still in Katie's arms, chose that moment to point at Margaret and babble something that sounded vaguely like "Mama." The effect on the family was immediate. Several of the children stiffened, and Margaret could see tears threatening to spill from Katie's eyes. "She doesn't understand," Katie said quickly, her voice tight with emotion. "She calls all women that. It doesn't mean anything." Margaret felt her heart break a little at the 9-year-old's need to protect everyone from the pain of that innocent word. "It's all right," she said gently. "I understand." And Katie, I want you to know that I don't expect you to call me Mama or Mother or anything like that, unless you want to. You can call me Margaret or Mrs. Brennan or whatever feels right too. You. The relief on Katie's face was visible, and Margaret realized she had just passed another crucial test. By not insisting on immediate acceptance of a maternal role, she had shown respect for the children's grief and their right to process their loss at their own pace. Daniel finally stepped forward, his relief evident at how well the initial meeting was going. Why don't we get Margaret's things inside, and then we can all sit down together and talk about how this is going to work? As the family began to move toward the house, Margaret caught sight of little Timothy, still clinging to Katie's hand and sucking his thumb as he stared at her with wide, solemn eyes. She knelt down to his level, careful not to move too quickly or seem threatening. "Hello, Timothy," she said softly. "You don't have to talk to me if you don't want to, but I want you to know that I'm very glad to meet you." Timothy didn't respond verbally, but he removed his thumb from his mouth long enough to wave his small hand at her. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt like a victory dot as Margaret straightened and followed the family toward the house that would be her new home. She felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 8 children, each with their own needs and wounds, were now partly her responsibility. A farm and household that required skills she had never developed were now hers to help maintain. A man who had offered her a chance at the family she had always wanted was now her partner in building something none of them had experienced before. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow would bring the real work of becoming a family, but tonight, Margaret Brennan was home. The interior of the Brennan house told the story of a family that had been slowly unraveling for over a year. Margaret stepped through the front door into a parlor that had once been carefully maintained, but now bore the telltale signs of children trying to manage adult responsibilities. Dust-coated surfaces that had clearly been loved, but were now simply endured. Mended furniture spoke of practical repairs made by inexperienced hands, and everywhere Margaret looked, she saw evidence of a household running on determination rather than knowledge. The kitchen, visible through an archway, presented an even more telling picture. Dishes were stacked haphazardly on shelves, clearly washed but not organized with any real system. A pot sat on the wood stove, emitting the aroma of what smelled like burned beans mixed with hope. 9-year-old Katie stood guard over the cooking area like a tiny general defending her territory, her jaw set with the kind of determination that broke Margaret's heart. "I made supper," Katie announced, her voice carrying both pride and defiance. "It's bean soup with cornbread. The bread might be a little hard on the bottom, but it's still good." Margaret could see the other children watching this exchange with careful attention. This was clearly a test of some kind. Would the new woman in their house criticize Katie's efforts or praise them? Would she try to take over immediately, or would she recognize the courage it had taken for a 9-year-old to keep the family fed for months? "Bean soup sounds wonderful," Margaret said warmly. "And cornbread is my favorite. Would you mind if I helped you serve it? I'd like to learn how you organize things around here." The relief that flickered across Katie's face was quickly replaced by suspicion. "You don't need to help. I can manage fine on my own." "I'm sure you can," Margaret agreed. "You've been managing beautifully. But now that I'm here, maybe we could manage together. That way, you could teach me your system instead of me coming in and changing everything around." This approach seemed to penetrate Katie's defenses slightly. The idea of being the teacher rather than being replaced clearly appealed to her need to maintain some control over her domain. Daniel cleared his throat from behind them. "Margaret, let me show you upstairs first so you can get settled. Katie, why don't you hold off on serving until we come back down? That way we can all eat together." The staircase was narrow but sturdy, leading to a hallway with 4 doors. Daniel opened the first door to reveal a room that was clearly meant for the older boys. 2 beds were crammed into the space, along with a chest of drawers and hooks on the wall for clothing. Everything was reasonably tidy, though Margaret could see evidence of the kind of casual organization that came from necessity rather than training. Michael and Patrick share this room, Daniel explained. They've gotten pretty good at not killing each other, though they have their moments. The second room housed the twins, Sean and Shannon. Their space was smaller but somehow felt more peaceful. Books were stacked on a makeshift shelf made from boards and bricks, and Margaret could see evidence of careful attention to keeping personal belongings organized and clean. The third room belonged to the girls. Katie's influence was obvious here. Clothes were folded and stacked with military precision, and baby Molly's few possessions were arranged with the kind of care that spoke of deep love. A small trundle bed had been pulled out for Timothy, who apparently slept with his sisters for comfort rather than with his older brothers. Timothy still has nightmares, Daniel explained quietly. Katie insists he sleep in here where she can comfort him if he wakes up scared. The final door led to what had clearly been the master bedroom. It was the largest of the 4 rooms, with windows facing both east and west to catch the morning and evening light. The bed was made with military precision, but Margaret could see that the room hadn't been truly lived in for some time. Personal items were arranged on the dresser as if waiting for someone to return and claim them. This was Catherine's room, Daniel said unnecessarily. I packed away most of her things, but I left some items out in case the children wanted to. Well, in case they needed reminders. The wardrobe has space for your belongings, and there's a chest at the foot of the bed for anything else you might need to store. Margaret set her small trunk on the chest and looked around the room that would be her sanctuary in this new life. It felt strange to be occupying space that had belonged to another woman, but she also sensed that Catherine would have wanted her home to continue sheltering people who needed care. The children are free to come in here anytime they want, she said. I don't want anyone to feel like this room is off limits now. Daniel nodded, his expression reflecting gratitude for her sensitivity. Catherine always said this house belonged to the children as much as to us. I'm glad you understand that. When they returned downstairs, they found the children had gathered around the kitchen table, which had been set with mismatched plates and cups that spoke of practical choices rather than aesthetic ones. Katie was ladling soup from the pot while Bridget helped by tearing pieces of cornbread and distributing them to each place setting. The meal itself was a study in family dynamics that had developed in the absence of consistent adult guidance. Michael sat at one end of the table, clearly claiming the position of authority, while the younger children clustered around Katie as if she were their lifeline. Patrick fidgeted constantly, earning sharp looks from his older brother, while the twins ate in synchronized movements that suggested they had developed their own private world of communication. Timothy sat pressed against Katie's side, accepting food but eating very little. Baby Molly was in a high chair that had clearly been built by hand, and she seemed more interested in throwing pieces of cornbread than consuming them. Timothy doesn't eat much at supper, Katie explained when she noticed Margaret watching the little boy. He gets hungry later, so I always save him some bread and milk before bed. Margaret nodded, filing away another piece of information about the complex needs of her new family. That makes sense. Everyone has their own rhythm when it comes to eating. The conversation during the meal was stilted at first, with the children clearly uncertain about how much they should reveal about their lives to this stranger, who had suddenly become part of their world. But gradually, as Margaret asked careful questions and showed genuine interest in their answers, the atmosphere began to relax. Sean, the quieter twin, mentioned that he had been reading a book about explorers, which led to a discussion about different parts of the world and what life might be like in distant places. Shannon, emboldened by her brother's willingness to talk, shared her observations about the wild animals she had been watching around the farm. Patrick, unable to contain his energy any longer, launched into an enthusiastic description of a fishing expedition he and Michael had taken to the creek the previous week. His story was full of exaggerations and dramatic gestures that made even serious Michael crack a smile. Bridget, the 7-year-old with hair that matched Margaret's own, remained mostly quiet but watched every interaction with the intense focus of a child trying to understand where she fit in this new configuration of family. As the meal progressed, Margaret began to see glimpses of what this family had been like before tragedy struck. There was genuine affection between the siblings, a foundation of love and loyalty that had sustained them through their darkest period. The dynamics were complicated by grief and premature responsibility, but the underlying bonds were strong. After supper, Catelli immediately began clearing the table, moving with the efficient motions of someone who had performed this task hundreds of times. Margaret rose to help, but Katie waved her away. "I can do it," Katie said firmly. "I always do the dishes after supper." "I know you can," Margaret replied. "But I was thinking we might do them together tonight. That way you could show me where everything goes, and we could talk about how you like to organize the kitchen." This compromise seemed acceptable to Katie, and soon they were working side by side at the wash basin. Margaret was careful to follow Katie's lead, asking questions about the girl's system rather than imposing her own ideas about how things should be done. "You keep the everyday dishes on the lower shelves," Margaret observed. "That's very practical, makes them easier for everyone to reach." "Mama used to keep the good china up high," Katie explained. "But after she got sick, I moved everything down so I could reach it better. The good dishes are in the pantry now, wrapped in towels so they don't break." Margaret heard the weight of adult decision-making in that simple explanation. A 9-year-old girl had been forced to make practical choices about household organization based on her physical limitations, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to grown-ups. "That was very smart thinking," Margaret said. "It sounds like you've figured out a lot of things that work well for your family." While they worked, the other children gradually drifted into the kitchen. Michael sat at the table, ostensibly supervising homework for the twins. But Margaret could see that he was also keeping a watchful eye on her interactions with Katie. Patrick had claimed a spot by the window, where he was working on some kind of wood carving project, his knife work careful despite his generally impulsive nature. Bridget had settled on the floor near the stove with a collection of corn husk dolls that appeared to be handmade. She was conducting an elaborate tea party, complete with conversations between the dolls that revealed her own thoughts about family and belonging. Timothy remained close to Katie, but Margaret noticed that he was gradually moving closer to where she stood at the wash basin. By the time the dishes were finished, he was standing near enough that she could have reached out and touched his dark hair. "Timothy," she said gently, "would you like to help me figure out where this pot goes?" The little boy looked up at her with solemn eyes, then nodded slowly. He took her hand and led her to a cabinet, pointing to a shelf where similar pots were stored. His small hand felt trusting in hers, and Margaret sensed that this was a significant moment in building his confidence in her presence. As evening settled over the farm, Daniel announced that it was time for the younger children to begin preparing for bed. This declaration triggered a complex series of negotiations and preparations that clearly followed a well-established routine. Katie took charge of getting Molly ready for sleep, while Bridget was responsible for making sure Timothy washed his face and hands. The twins had apparently worked out their own system for sharing the wash basin and organizing their nighttime belongings. Margaret found herself assigned the role of observer, with each child carefully explaining their particular routine and requirements. Timothy needed his favorite blanket, which was actually a flour sack that had been worn soft by constant handling. Bridget required a specific arrangement of her corn husk dolls on the chair beside her bed. Molly had a complex ritual involving a wooden horse that Daniel had carved, which needed to be placed just so in her crib. The process of getting everyone settled took nearly an hour, with multiple trips upstairs, various requests for drinks of water, and the kind of gradual wind down that came from children who were accustomed to comforting each other through the transition from day to night. As Margaret helped tuck blankets around small bodies and listen to whispered conversations between siblings, she began to understand the intricate web of mutual support that had developed in this family. Each child had taken on specific roles and responsibilities that went far beyond what would normally be expected at their ages. Katie was clearly the primary caregiver, but Michael served as the ultimate authority figure. Patrick had become the family entertainer, using his energy and humor to distract from sadness when needed. The twins provided intellectual stimulation and calm presence for the younger ones. Bridget had appointed herself as Timothy's special protector, and even baby Molly seemed to sense her role as the source of innocence and joy that kept everyone grounded in the present rather than lost in grief. When the children were finally settled and the house had grown quiet, Margaret found herself sitting in the parlor with Daniel, both of them exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, providing warmth against the mountain evening's chill. "How do you think it went?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was prepared for honest criticism. Margaret considered the question seriously. "I think your children are remarkable," she said finally. "They've created something beautiful out of terrible circumstances. Katie has taken on responsibilities that would challenge a grown woman, and Michael has become a leader when he should still be learning how to be a young man. All of them have found ways to take care of each other that show incredible maturity and love." Daniel's relief was visible. But they're all carrying burdens that are too heavy for their ages," Margaret continued. "Katie needs to learn how to be a 9-year-old again, at least some of the time. Michael needs to discover that he can be protective without carrying the entire weight of the family on his shoulders. Patrick needs outlets for his energy that don't involve getting into trouble. And Timothy—" She paused, thinking about the little boy who had finally begun to trust her enough to take her hand. "Timothy needs to feel safe enough to find his voice again," she finished. "They all need to learn that they can depend on adults to handle the adult responsibilities." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's what I was hoping you could help with. I've been trying, but I'm only one person, and I don't always know. I mean, Catherine knew how to balance everything. She knew when to be gentle and when to be firm, when to comfort and when to challenge them to grow." Margaret looked around the parlor, seeing evidence of Catherine's presence in the carefully chosen furniture and the handmade touches that had created a home rather than just a house. "I'm not Catherine," she said quietly. "I'll never be able to do things exactly the way she did them. But maybe that's all right. Maybe what your family needs now is someone who can help them build something new while still honoring what came before. I think," Daniel said carefully, "that you might be exactly what we needed, even if none of us knew it at the time." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the magnitude of the changes that had occurred in a single day. Margaret found herself thinking about the woman she had been that morning, desperate, broken, defined by what she couldn't do. That woman felt like a stranger now, replaced by someone who had found purpose in the most unexpected place. A soft sound from upstairs interrupted her thoughts. It was the murmur of voices, followed by quiet footsteps in the hallway above. Margaret looked questioningly at Daniel, who smiled for the first time since she had met him. "Bridget's probably having a bad dream," he explained. "Katie usually handles it, but sometimes the whole family gets involved. You'll get used to the middle-of-the-night conferences." Sure enough, a few minutes later, Katie appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, carrying a sleepy-looking Timothy. "Bridget had this scared dream again," she reported matter-of-factly. "Timothy woke up when she cried, and now Molly's fussing because everyone's awake." Margaret rose from her chair. "Would it help if I came up? I don't want to interfere, but maybe an extra pair of hands." Katie considered this offer with the serious deliberation of a much older person. "You could hold Timothy while I get Bridget settled again. He likes to be rocked when he's upset." Following Katie upstairs, Margaret found herself in the middle of a well-orchestrated crisis management routine. Sean and Shannon were awake, but staying quietly in their beds, providing a calm presence without adding to the chaos. Michael had emerged from his room and was speaking in low, reassuring tones to Bridget, who was clinging to her corn-husk dolls and hiccuping with the aftermath of whatever had frightened her in her dreams. Patrick, surprisingly, had taken charge of baby Molly, bouncing her gently while humming a tuneless melody that seemed to be working to calm her fussing. Margaret settled into the rocking chair in the girls' room with Timothy in her lap, feeling his small body gradually relax as the steady motion and soft singing from various family members created a cocoon of safety around all of them. This was clearly a routine they had developed through necessity, a way of handling the nighttime fears that seemed to visit the family regularly. As calm gradually returned to the household and children began drifting back to their beds, Margaret realized she had just experienced something precious and rare. She had been included, without question or ceremony, in the intimate family ritual of caring for each other through difficult moments. Timothy had fallen asleep in her arms, his thumb finding its way to his mouth as his breathing deepened. Katie appeared beside the rocking chair, her face soft with exhaustion and something that might have been gratitude. "You can put him in his bed now," she whispered. "He'll sleep the rest of the night once he's settled again." As Margaret gently transferred the sleeping child to his small bed and pulled his worn blanket up around his shoulders, she felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since Dr. Harrison had delivered his devastating diagnosis, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The house settled into peaceful quiet once more, but Margaret remained awake for a long time, listening to the soft sounds of a family sleeping safely under one roof. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to prove herself worthy of the trust these children were slowly beginning to place in her. But tonight, she was simply Margaret Brennan, mother to 8 children who needed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Outside her window, an owl called across the mountain valley, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly as they settled for the night. The sounds of the farm were becoming familiar already, weaving themselves into the fabric of her new identity as a woman who belonged somewhere, who had purpose beyond her own survival. As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last conscious thought was of Timothy's small hand trustingly taking hers, and the way Bridget's frightened cries had turned to peaceful breathing when surrounded by the love of her family. Tomorrow she would begin learning how to be the kind of mother these children deserved. Tonight, it was enough to know that she was home. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's arrival at the Brennan farm, and the rhythm of daily life had begun to settle into something resembling normalcy. The children's initial wariness had given way to cautious acceptance, and Margaret had found herself gradually taking on more responsibilities as Katie slowly allowed herself to step back from some of the burdens she had carried alone for so long. The morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance. Margaret would rise before dawn to start the fire and begin breakfast preparations, while Katie took charge of getting the younger children dressed and ready for their day. Michael and Patrick handled the morning barn chores, milking the cows and feeding the livestock, while the twins helped with gathering eggs and preparing the older children for the mile-long walk to the one-room schoolhouse. But beneath this surface of domestic tranquility, Margaret had begun to sense undercurrents of tension that had nothing to do with the family's adjustment to her presence. Daniel had grown increasingly preoccupied, often standing at the kitchen window with his coffee cup, staring out at the surrounding hills with an expression that spoke of worry rather than appreciation for the mountain scenery. The first concrete sign of trouble came on a Thursday morning when Marcus Henderson, their nearest neighbor, rode into the farmyard with news that sent a chill through Margaret's bones, despite the warm autumn sunshine. "Daniel, Marcus called out as he dismounted near the barn. "We need to talk. It's about Weatherby." Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, but the urgency in Marcus's voice carried clearly across the yard. She could see Daniel emerge from the barn, his posture immediately tense as he recognized the gravity in his neighbor's demeanor. "What about the Weatherby place?" Daniel asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected what he was about to hear. "Burned out 3 nights ago," Marcus replied grimly. "The whole family, John, Mary, and their 2 boys. Someone set fire to the house while they were sleeping. They barely got out alive, and now they've got nothing but the clothes on their backs." Margaret felt her hands still on the wet shirt she was pinning to the line. The Weatherby farm was only 5 miles east of their property, close enough that they could see smoke from its chimney on clear days. The idea that such violence could strike so near to their own home sent terror racing through her veins. "Any idea who might have done it?" Daniel asked, though his voice had taken on a quality that suggested he had his own suspicions. "Josiah Cromwell's men have been asking questions around town," Marcus said, his voice dropping lower. "Seems they've been offering to buy out homesteaders all through the valley, and the Weatherbys weren't interested in selling. Word is, Cromwell's planning to run cattle on all this land, and he doesn't much care whether the current owners want to leave or not." Margaret had heard the name Josiah Cromwell whispered in town during her few trips to the general store. He was a powerful rancher from the territorial capital who had been systematically buying up smaller farms and homesteads, consolidating land for what he claimed would be the largest cattle operation in the territory. Those who sold to him voluntarily received fair compensation. Those who refused to sell often found themselves facing mysterious difficulties: diseased livestock, poisoned water sources, or in the most extreme cases, fires that consumed everything they had worked to build. "Has anyone gone to the territorial marshal?" Daniel asked. Marcus shook his head with bitter resignation. "Marshal Stevens is in Cromwell's pocket, has been for years. The territorial government isn't interested in protecting small farmers when there's big money involved. We're on our own out here, Daniel, and Cromwell knows it." Margaret abandoned her laundry and moved closer to where the 2 men were talking, her concern for the family's safety overriding any consideration of propriety. "What about the other families in the valley?" she asked. "Surely if everyone stands together... Marcus looked at her with an expression that mixed sympathy with harsh realism. "Mrs. Brennan, in the past 6 months, Cromwell has convinced or forced out 7 families from this valley alone. The McAllister place, the Johnson homestead, the Peterson farm, all of them sold out or abandoned their claims. Those of us left are starting to feel like we're fighting a losing battle." Daniel's jaw was set in the stubborn line that Margaret had learned to recognize as his response to being backed into a corner. "This is our home, Marcus. Catherine's buried on that hill, and my children have never known any other place. I'm not running just because some rich man from the capital thinks he can buy himself a kingdom." "I'm not saying you should run," Marcus replied carefully. "I'm saying you should be prepared. Cromwell's got men who specialize in making life unpleasant for folks who won't cooperate. And with 8 children to protect." He let the implication hang in the air. After Marcus left, Margaret found Daniel standing in the barn, ostensibly checking on the horses but clearly lost in worried thoughts. She approached him carefully, having learned over the past weeks that he needed space to process difficult situations before he was ready to discuss them. "How long have you known this was coming?" she asked quietly. Daniel didn't look up from the bridle he was examining for the 3rd time. "Cromwell's men came by about 2 months ago, made what they called a generous offer for the farm. I told them we weren't interested in selling, and they said they'd be back when I had time to think about it more seriously." "And you didn't think to mention this when you were asking me to become part of this family?" Margaret tried to keep the accusation out of her voice, but she couldn't entirely suppress her feeling of having been deceived about what she was getting into. Would it have changed your mind? Daniel asked, finally meeting her eyes. If I had told you that marrying me might mean putting yourself in danger, would you have said yes at that auction? Margaret considered the question honestly. I don't know, she admitted. But I had a right to know what I was choosing. You had a right to a lot of things, Daniel replied with bitter honesty. You had a right to a husband who courted you properly, a wedding with flowers and music, a honeymoon somewhere beautiful. You had a right to bear your own children and raise them in safety and prosperity. Life doesn't seem particularly concerned with giving any of us what we have a right to. His words stung, but Margaret could hear the fear underneath his anger. This was a man who had already lost the most important person in his world, and now he was facing the possibility of losing everything else he cared about. So what do we do? She asked. We protect what's ours, Daniel said firmly. We make sure the children understand what might be coming, and we prepare for whatever Cromwell decides to throw at us. That evening, after the younger children had been put to bed, Daniel gathered the older ones around the kitchen table for a conversation that would change the tenor of their daily lives. Margaret sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she watched the faces of children who had already endured too much loss and uncertainty. I need to tell you all about something that's happening in our valley, Daniel began, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was about to share. There's a man named Josiah Cromwell who wants to buy our farm and all the other farms around here. Some families have already sold him, but we're not going to. Michael leaned forward, his 15-year-old mind immediately grasping the implications. What happens to the families who don't want to sell? Sometimes they find ways to convince people to change their minds, Daniel replied carefully. The Weatherby place burned down 3 nights ago, and it wasn't an accident. The twins exchanged worried glances while Katie's face went pale. Patrick, true to his nature, immediately wanted to know about the details of the confrontation they might be facing. Are they going to try to burn our house down too? He asked, his voice carrying more excitement than fear. We're going to make sure they don't get the chance, Daniel said firmly. But that means all of you need to understand some new rules. No one goes anywhere alone, especially not the younger children. When you're at school, you stay together and come straight home afterward. If you see strangers on our property, you come and find me or Margaret immediately. Shannon, the more outspoken of the twins, raised her hand as if she were in school. What if they come when you're not here? Margaret spoke up for the first time. Then you follow the plan your father and I are going to work out. We'll have places for everyone to hide, and we'll make sure you know exactly what to do if trouble comes. Over the following days, the farm took on the atmosphere of a fortress under siege. Daniel began carrying his rifle with him, even for routine chores, and he taught Margaret how to load and fire both the rifle and the shotgun that hung above the kitchen door. The children's daily routines were adjusted to ensure that someone was always watching the approaches to the farm, and Margaret found herself constantly counting heads to make sure all 8 children were accounted for. The psychological toll of living under constant threat began to show in different ways across the family. Katie, who had been gradually learning to let Margaret take on more of the household responsibilities, reverted to her hyper-vigilant caretaking as a way of managing her anxiety. Michael became even more serious and protective, appointing himself as an unofficial guard who checked and rechecked the security of doors and windows throughout the day. Patrick's response to stress was to become increasingly reckless, as if he were trying to prove that he wasn't afraid of whatever dangers might be lurking around their farm. Margaret found herself having to curb his impulses to explore areas that were now considered off-limits or to confront imaginary threats with inappropriate bravado. The twins dealt with their fear by becoming even more inseparable than usual, developing an elaborate system of hand signals and coded words that allowed them to communicate their observations about potential threats without alarming the younger children. Timothy's progress in overcoming his selective mutism came to a complete halt as the stress of the situation triggered a return to his most withdrawn behaviors. He stopped speaking entirely again and began following Margaret or Daniel so closely that he was literally underfoot during most of their daily activities. Even baby Molly seemed to sense the tension in the household, becoming fussier and more clingy than she had been since Margaret's arrival. The first direct confrontation came on a Tuesday afternoon when Margaret was in the vegetable garden with Bridget and Timothy, harvesting the last of the summer squash before the first frost could damage them. The children were playing a game that involved pretending the squash were treasure that needed to be rescued from an evil dragon, their laughter providing a brief respite from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the farm. Margaret heard the horses before she saw them, the sound of multiple riders approaching at a pace that was too fast for a social visit. She immediately stood up, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun as she tried to count the number of men approaching their farmyard. "Bridget, Timothy," she said calmly, though her heart was racing, "I want you to go into the house right now and find Katie. Tell her to gather everyone in the root cellar like we practiced." The children had been drilled on this procedure multiple times over the past week, and they responded immediately to the code words Margaret had used. Bridget grabbed Timothy's hand and they ran toward the house, moving with the kind of speed that only came from genuine fear. Margaret followed them as far as the kitchen door, then positioned herself on the front porch where she could see the approaching riders, while still being close enough to the house to retreat if necessary. Daniel emerged from the barn, his rifle carried casually but ready for use. There were 4 men on horseback, all of them dressed in the kind of clothes that suggested they were more comfortable in saloons than on working farms. The man in the lead was tall and lean, with cold eyes and a handlebar mustache that had been waxed to sharp points. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to intimidating people from horseback. "Afternoon, folks," he called out, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Name's Luther Hobbs. I work for Mr. Josiah Cromwell, and I believe he's made you folks a generous offer for this property." Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself between the strangers and the house where his children were hidden. "Mr. Cromwell's offer was considered and declined. I believe that was made clear to his previous representatives." Hobbs smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Well, see, that's the thing about Mr. Cromwell's offers. They tend to get more generous over time, especially when folks take the opportunity to really think about their situations." He gestured broadly at the farm buildings and the surrounding fields. "This is a nice spread you've got here, Mr. Brennan. It would be a real shame if something happened to it. Accidents can occur so easily on these remote properties, fires, stampedes, all sorts of unfortunate events that can destroy years of hard work in a matter of minutes." Margaret felt rage building in her chest at the casual way this stranger was threatening everything they had worked to build. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Hobbs?" Hobbs turned his attention to her for the first time, his gaze moving over her in a way that made her feel like she needed a bath. "Why, no, ma'am. I'm just making conversation about the various hazards that can befall isolated farming families. Though I do have to say, it's interesting that Brennan here has acquired himself a new wife since our last visit. Word around town is that you came from one of those matrimonial auctions they hold down in Millbrook." The way he said it made it sound sordid and shameful, and Margaret could see Daniel's knuckles going white where he gripped his rifle. "My wife's background is none of your concern," Daniel said, his voice carrying a warning that even a man like Hobbs couldn't miss. "Oh, but it is my concern," Hobbs replied smoothly. "See, Mr. Cromwell is very interested in the welfare of all the families in this valley. And when a man suddenly acquires a wife and 8 children to worry about, well, that changes his perspective on what risks he's willing to take." One of the other riders, a heavy-set man with a scar running down the left side of his face, leaned forward in his saddle. "Pretty woman like that. And all those children, lot of things could happen to them if their menfolk aren't careful about the decisions they make. The threat was unmistakable, and Margaret saw Daniel's grip shift on his rifle as he prepared to raise it. But before the confrontation could escalate further, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Papa!" It was Timothy, his small voice carrying clearly across the farmyard, as he broke from his hiding place and ran toward Daniel. Margaret's heart stopped as she realized the little boy had disobeyed their carefully rehearsed safety plan. But his appearance seemed to shift something in the dynamic of the confrontation. Hobbs looked down at the 5-year-old clinging to Daniel's leg, and for a moment, his expression showed something that might have been uncertainty. Threatening adults was one thing, but even men like Hobbs had lines they were reluctant to cross in front of witnesses. "Cute kid," he said finally. It would be a real shame if he grew up without a father because his old man made some poor decisions. Daniel's voice when he answered was steady and implacable. "My decision is final, Mr. Hobbs. This farm is not for sale at any price. I suggest you and your men leave our property now, before this conversation becomes something we'll all regret." Hobbs remounted his horse, but his expression made it clear that this was not the end of their interest in the Brennan farm. "Mr. Cromwell is a patient man, Brennan, but his patience isn't unlimited. You might want to think real hard about what's best for your family." As the 4 riders wheeled their horses and rode away, Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. But she also knew that this had been just the opening move in what would likely be a much more dangerous game. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret and Daniel sat up late, making plans for defending their home and family against whatever Cromwell might send against them next. The stakes had been made clear. This was no longer just about keeping their farm. It was about protecting 8 children who had already lost too much, and a woman who had finally found the family she had always dreamed of having. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain passes, and in the distance, a wolf called to its pack. The sounds of the wilderness that had once seemed peaceful now felt ominous, full of potential threats lurking just beyond the circle of light cast by their kitchen windows. The battle for their home was just beginning. The attack came 3 days later, under the cover of a moonless night, when the mountain darkness pressed against the farmhouse windows like a living thing. Margaret woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the terrified screaming of horses in the barn. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought she was still dreaming, but then Daniel's voice cut through her confusion as he burst through the bedroom door. "Margaret, get the children to the root cellar now. The barn's on fire." She threw on her wrapper and rushed into the hallway, where chaos was already erupting. Katie had emerged from the girls' room carrying Molly, while Bridget clung to her nightgown with wide, terrified eyes. The twins appeared from their doorway, Sean carrying the emergency bag they had packed according to Daniel's instructions, while Shannon herded Timothy ahead of her. "Where are Michael and Patrick?" Margaret called out, even as she began guiding the younger children toward the stairs. "Already outside with Papa," Katie replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "They went to help save the horses." Through the windows, Margaret could see the barn engulfed in flames that reached toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. The sight filled her with a terror that went beyond the immediate danger. This was their livelihood burning, the foundation of everything the family depended on for survival. But there was no time for despair. She had 8 children to protect, and the root cellar that Daniel had reinforced over the past weeks was their only chance of safety. If Cromwell's men decided to extend their destruction to the house itself, the root cellar was accessed through the kitchen, its heavy wooden door concealed beneath a braided rug that Daniel had positioned to hide the entrance. Margaret lifted the door and began helping the children down the wooden ladder into the underground space that had been expanded and stocked with supplies for exactly this situation. Oil lamps had been positioned throughout the cellar, along with blankets, water, and enough food to sustain the family for several days if necessary. Daniel had even installed ventilation shafts that would allow them to breathe safely while remaining hidden from anyone searching the house above. "Katie, light the lamps," Margaret instructed as she handed Molly down to the older girl. "Shannon, help Timothy get settled in the corner where we arranged his blankets. Sean, can you check that the water barrels are still secure?" The children moved with the efficiency that came from having practiced this evacuation multiple times. But Margaret could see the fear in their faces as the reality of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't a drill. Their home was under attack, and their father and older brothers were outside facing whatever dangers had come with the fire. As the last child descended into the cellar, Margaret heard the sound of gunshots from the direction of the barn. Her blood turned to ice as she realized that Daniel and the boys were not just fighting a fire. They were fighting for their lives. She was torn between her duty to stay with the children and her desperate need to help defend the farm. But before she could make a decision, the kitchen door above them burst open and she heard heavy footsteps moving across the floor. "Search every room," a rough voice commanded. "Cromwell wants to know how many people we're dealing with here." Margaret quickly extinguished the lamp she had been holding and pressed her finger to her lips, signaling for absolute silence from the children. In the darkness of the cellar, she could hear her own heartbeat and the soft, frightened breathing of 8 young people who were depending on her to keep them safe. The footsteps moved through the house methodically, accompanied by the sounds of furniture being overturned and drawers being pulled open. Margaret could hear at least 3 different voices, suggesting that multiple intruders had entered their home, while Daniel and the boys were occupied with the barn fire. "Nothing upstairs but kids' rooms," one voice reported. "Looks like they got out fast. Beds are empty, but still warm." "Keep looking," the commanding voice replied. "Brennan's got 8 kids and a wife. They didn't just disappear into thin air." Margaret felt Katie press closer to her in the darkness, and she could sense the older girl's terror at hearing strangers discussing their family like prey to be hunted. Baby Molly began to fuss softly, and Margaret quickly covered the child's mouth with her hand, praying that the sound wouldn't carry upward. The search continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Margaret could hear the men discussing whether to set fire to the house, and she realized with growing horror that they might all be trapped in the cellar if the building above them was destroyed. Then, suddenly, the sounds of the search stopped. Margaret heard rapid footsteps moving toward the door, followed by shouted voices from outside. "Riders coming from the east. Could be the marshal. Time to go. Cromwell said no witnesses if the law shows up." The kitchen door slammed shut and Margaret heard the thunder of horses' hooves moving away from the farmhouse at high speed. But she didn't dare move or allow the children to make any noise until she was certain the danger had passed. They waited in the darkness for nearly an hour before Margaret finally heard Daniel's voice calling from above. "Margaret, children, it's safe now. You can come out." The relief in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she began helping the children climb the ladder back into the kitchen. They emerged into a house that had been ransacked but not destroyed, with furniture overturned and personal belongings scattered across the floors. Daniel was waiting for them, his face blackened with soot and his clothes singed from fighting the fire. Michael and Patrick stood beside him, both looking older than their years after their first real taste of adult violence. "The barn?" Margaret asked, though she could see the answer in Daniel's expression. "Gone," he said simply. "We saved most of the horses and cattle, but the building and everything in it is a total loss. The hay, the grain stores, the equipment, all of it." Margaret felt the magnitude of the disaster settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Without the barn and its contents, the farm couldn't function. There would be no way to feed the livestock through the winter, no way to store crops or maintain the equipment necessary for next year's planting. "But we're all alive," Daniel continued. his voice carrying a fierce gratitude that reminded Margaret of what truly mattered. And that's more than I dared hope for when I saw those flames. Katie had been examining the damage to the kitchen, and she spoke up with the practical voice of someone who had learned to focus on immediate necessities. The stove still works, and they didn't break our dishes. I can make breakfast if someone can milk the cows. Her matter-of-fact approach to dealing with catastrophe reminded Margaret of the incredible resilience these children had developed through their various losses. They knew how to survive, how to find hope in the midst of destruction. First things first, Daniel said. We need to secure the house and make sure there aren't any more surprises waiting for us. Michael, Patrick, help me check every building and make sure we're really alone. As the males of the family went to ensure their immediate safety, Margaret began helping the children restore some order to their ransacked home. The intruders had been thorough but not particularly destructive. They had clearly been searching for people rather than trying to inflict maximum damage to property. While they worked, Margaret's mind was racing with questions about their immediate future. Without the barn, how would they survive the coming winter? How could they rebuild when they had no resources and no guarantee that Cromwell wouldn't simply destroy anything they managed to construct? But beneath her practical concerns was a deeper realization that filled her with both pride and determination. The children had performed exactly as they had been trained, following their emergency procedures without panic or hesitation. Even more importantly, they had remained a family unit throughout the crisis, supporting each other and looking to the adults for leadership without falling apart under pressure. When Daniel returned from his security check, he gathered the family around the kitchen table for a conversation that would determine their path forward. The damage is extensive, but not impossible to overcome, he began. We've lost the barn and most of our stored supplies, but the house is intact and most of the livestock survived. The question is whether we try to rebuild here or whether we accept that Cromwell has won this round. Michael spoke up immediately, his young voice carrying a determination that reminded Margaret of his father. We don't run. This is our home. And Mama's buried on that hill. We don't let some rich man from the capital drive us away from where we belong. Patrick nodded emphatically. Besides, where would we go? This farm is all we've ever known. The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications before Sean spoke for both of them. We want to stay too. But how can we rebuild if they're just going to burn it down again? It was a valid question, and Margaret could see Daniel struggling with the same concerns that were plaguing her own thoughts. How could they protect what they built when their enemies had shown they were willing to use violence to achieve their goals? There might be a way, Margaret said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. But it would require help from people we can trust, and it would mean taking some significant risks. Daniel looked at her with interest. What are you thinking? Marcus Henderson mentioned that other families in the valley are facing the same pressure, Margaret replied. What if we convinced them to stand together? Not just in principle, but in a practical way that would make it much harder for Cromwell to pick us off one by one. You mean like forming some kind of alliance? Katie asked, her 9-year-old mind immediately grasping the concept. Exactly, Margaret said. If we could coordinate our defenses, share resources, and present a united front, Cromwell would have to deal with all of us at once instead of terrorizing isolated families. Daniel was nodding thoughtfully. It could work, but it would require convincing people who are already scared to take even bigger risks. And it would mean trusting our neighbors with our lives. We're already trusting our lives to our own ability to defend this place, Margaret pointed out. At least this way, we wouldn't be facing the threat alone. The conversation continued for another hour, with each family member contributing ideas about how such an alliance might work. Even Timothy offered a suggestion, whispering to Katie that they could use the children to carry messages between farms, since no one would suspect kids of organizing resistance. By by the time the sun rose over the burned remains of their barn. The Brennan family had developed the framework of a plan that would either save their community or get them all killed in the attempt. Over the following week, Daniel and Margaret began the delicate process of reaching out to their neighbors. Marcus Henderson was enthusiastic about the idea, as were the Kowalski family and the elderly Prescott couple, who ran a small sheep operation in the northern part of the valley. Margaret found herself thinking about the woman she had been just months earlier, broken, worthless, defined by what she couldn't do. That woman would never have imagined herself sitting at a war council, helping to plan the defense of an entire community. But that woman had never had 8 children depending on her, had never experienced the fierce protectiveness that came with finally belonging somewhere. "We have advantages they don't expect," she said, spreading her own notes across the map. "They're planning to attack farms, but we're not going to be on our farms. We're going to be where they don't expect us to be, and we're going to make them come to us on the ground we choose." The plan that emerged from that night's discussion was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than trying to defend scattered homesteads against overwhelming force, the alliance would consolidate their defense at the most defensible location in the valley, the old mining camp high in the mountains where prospectors had once searched for silver. The camp was accessible by only 2 narrow trails, both of which could be easily defended by small numbers of determined fighters. More importantly, the site had natural caves that could shelter the women and children while the men held the approaches. "It means abandoning our homes," Daniel said quietly. "Everything we've built, everything we've worked for." "Buildings can be rebuilt," Margaret replied. "Children can't be brought back from the dead." The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation that transformed the entire valley into a coordinated evacuation operation. Livestock were driven into the high pastures where they could survive on their own if necessary. Essential supplies were packed and transported to the mining camp. Most importantly, every family began the psychological process of leaving behind the places they had called home, possibly forever. Margaret found herself coordinating the movement of children and supplies, a responsibility that had fallen to her naturally as the other women recognized her organizational abilities and calm demeanor under pressure. She organized the children into groups based on age and capability, assigning older children as leaders for younger ones and establishing clear chains of command in case adults became unavailable. Katie had thrown herself into the preparations with the same intensity she had once devoted to managing the household after her mother's death. But now, instead of carrying the burden alone, she was working as part of a team, teaching other children the survival skills she had mastered through necessity. "Make sure you pack your extra socks in the middle of your bundle," she instructed 10-year-old Anna Kowalski. "They'll stay drier there, and dry feet might save your life if we have to move fast." Michael and Patrick had become invaluable as scouts and messengers, using their knowledge of the mountain trails to identify the best defensive positions and escape routes. The twins had appointed themselves as the camp's intelligence network, developing an elaborate system of signals and codes that would allow communication even if the defenders were separated. Even Timothy had found his role in the preparations, using his small size and natural stealth to help establish hidden supply caches along the trails leading to the mining camp. His transformation from the nearly mute child Margaret had first met to a confident contributor to their survival efforts was perhaps the most remarkable change of all. As they prepared to leave the farm for what might be the last time, Margaret stood in the doorway of the house that had become her home, trying to memorize every detail. The kitchen where she had learned to cook for 8 hungry children. The parlor where they had spent winter evenings reading and talking by firelight. The bedroom that had given her privacy and dignity when she had desperately needed both. "Having second thoughts?" Daniel asked, appearing beside her with the last load of essential supplies. "Just saying goodbye," Margaret replied. "I want to remember it the way it is now, not the way it might look after Cromwell's men are finished with it. Daniel set down his bundle and looked around the home he had shared with Catherine, where he had raised his children, where he had built a life worth defending. Catherine used to say that home wasn't a place, it was the people you loved. I'm beginning to understand what she meant. The journey to the mining camp took most of the day, with families moving in small groups. To avoid creating obvious trails that could be followed, Margaret traveled with the largest group of children, including all 8 of the Brennan offspring, plus 6 others, whose parents were handling specific aspects of the evacuation. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and colder, reminding everyone that winter was approaching rapidly. If their plan failed, if they were forced to remain in the mountains for an extended period, the weather itself could become their enemy. The mining camp was more extensive than Margaret had expected, with several buildings still standing and a network of tunnels that had been carved into the mountainside during the silver prospecting days. The miners had abandoned the site when the ore played out, but their infrastructure remained largely intact. Daniel and the other men immediately began fortifying the approaches to the camp, using fallen trees and mining equipment to create barriers that would channel any attackers into killing zones where the defenders' limited numbers could be most effective. Margaret organized the women and children in establishing living quarters in the safest parts of the site, away from the approaches, where fighting would occur if their defenses were breached. The mining tunnels provided natural shelter, and the women had brought enough supplies to sustain everyone for at least a week. As night fell, the defenders took their positions and settled in to wait. The men were stationed at strategic points along the 2 trails, armed with rifles and shotguns and whatever military knowledge they had accumulated through hunting and frontier life. The women remained with the children but were prepared to fight if the defensive lines were broken. Margaret found herself in command of the evacuation routes, responsible for getting the children to safety if the battle went against them. It was a responsibility that terrified her, not because she feared for her own life, but because she knew that dozens of young lives would depend on her decisions in the critical moments that might determine their survival. The attack came just before dawn, as Cromwell's intelligence had suggested it would. Margaret was awakened by the sound of gunfire echoing off the mountain walls, a harsh staccato rhythm that announced the beginning of the battle for their community's survival. She quickly roused the children, implementing the evacuation procedures they had practiced until everyone could perform them automatically. The younger children were moved deeper into the mining tunnels, while the older ones took positions where they could serve as messengers and lookouts. From her position near the tunnel entrance, Margaret could see flashes of gunfire illuminating the darkness as the valley's defenders engaged Cromwell's mercenaries. The sound was constant now, punctuated by shouts and the occasional scream that sent chills down her spine. "They're trying to flank us on the North Trail," Patrick reported, appearing suddenly at Margaret's side. The 13-year-old had been serving as a messenger between the defensive positions, his knowledge of the mountain terrain making him invaluable for maintaining communication. "How many?" Margaret asked, her mind already calculating whether they needed to begin evacuating to the deeper tunnels. "Papa thinks maybe 8 or 10 men. Michael and Mr. Henderson are holding them, but they might need help." Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. "Tell your father that I'm moving the children to the deep tunnels, but I'm coming to help hold the North Trail. Some of those men might try to circle around and come at us from behind." Patrick's eyes widened. "Papa said you should stay with the children no matter what happens. The children will be safer if we stop those men before they can get behind." "Our defenses," Margaret replied, checking the shotgun that Daniel had insisted she carry. "Tell Katie she's in charge of the little ones until I get back." Margaret made her way through the darkness toward the sound of gunfire on the North Trail, moving carefully to avoid alerting Cromwell's men to her presence. As she got closer to the fighting, she could see the muzzle flashes from both sides and could hear Michael's voice shouting warnings to the other defenders. The scene that greeted her was one of desperate courage against overwhelming odds. Michael, Marcus Henderson, and 2 other farmers were positioned behind a makeshift barricade, firing at an enemy they could barely see in the python darkness. Margaret could tell from the pattern of return fire that they were heavily outnumbered and in danger of being overrun. She found a position behind a fallen tree that gave her a clear view of the trail where Cromwell's men would have to advance, and settled in to wait for targets. The shotgun wasn't accurate at long range, but it would be devastating at close quarters if any of the attackers managed to break through the main defensive line. The battle raged for nearly an hour, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. But gradually, Margaret began to realize that Cromwell's professional fighters were making the crucial mistake. They were fighting like soldiers, trying to achieve military objectives, while the valley's defenders were fighting like parents protecting their children. The difference was crucial. Cromwell's men had been hired to do a job, and when that job became more costly and dangerous than anticipated, their commitment began to waver. The farmers, on the other hand, were fighting for everything they had in the world, and their determination only grew stronger as the battle continued. The turning point came when Margaret spotted 3 men trying to work their way around the main defensive position, using the darkness and rough terrain to flank the farmers. She waited until they were close enough that missing would be almost impossible, then opened fire with the shotgun. The blast echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, and 2 of the 3 men went down immediately. The 3rd managed to return fire, but his shot went wide, and Marcus Henderson was able to finish him from his position behind the barricade. More importantly, the sound of the shotgun blast alerted the other defenders to the flanking attempt, allowing them to redirect their fire and prevent Cromwell's men from achieving their tactical objective. As dawn began to break over the mountains, the pattern of gunfire began to change. Instead of the sustained assault that had characterized the early stages of the battle, Cromwell's men were now firing sporadically, suggesting that their numbers had been significantly reduced. By full daylight, an eerie quiet had settled over the mining camp. Margaret could see several bodies scattered along the trails, but she couldn't tell from her position whether any of them belonged to the valley's defenders. "Margaret!" Daniel's voice called out from somewhere near the main defensive position. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she called back, rising carefully from her position behind the fallen tree. "What's the situation?" "They're pulling back," Daniel replied, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. "Looks like they've had enough fighting for one day." As the defenders began to emerge from their positions, Margaret could see the cost of their victory. 3 of the valley's men had been wounded, though none fatally, while at least 8 of Cromwell's mercenaries lay dead on the mountain trails. More importantly, the survivors of Cromwell's force were retreating toward the valley floor, abandoning their mission and leaving their employers' plans in ruins. The celebration was muted, tempered by the knowledge that they had been forced to kill other human beings in defense of their homes and families. But there was also a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. They had faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious through courage, determination, and their willingness to support each other. As the families began the process of returning to their farms, they found that Cromwell's men had indeed attempted to burn their homes during the night. But the fires had been hastily set and poorly executed, resulting in damage that was extensive but not total. Most of the houses could be repaired, and the barns and outbuildings could be rebuilt. More importantly, word of the battle spread quickly throughout the territory, reaching the ears of officials who had previously been reluctant to challenge Cromwell's activities. The territorial governor, faced with evidence of organized violence against legitimate homesteaders, finally ordered a full investigation into Cromwell's land acquisition methods. Within a month, Josiah Cromwell found himself facing federal charges for conspiracy, murder, and violation of homestead laws. His vast cattle empire began to crumble as his illegal activities were exposed, and many of the families he had forced from their land received compensation for their losses. But for Margaret, the real victory wasn't the defeat of Cromwell or the restoration of peace to the valley. The real victory was what she saw when she looked around the dinner table that first night back at the rebuilt Brennan farm. 8 children who had learned that they could face any challenge as long as they stood together. A husband who had discovered that the woman he had chosen to help raise his children was also a partner he could depend on in any crisis. A community that had been forged in fire and would never again doubt its ability to protect what mattered most. As winter settled over the mountain valley, Margaret often found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching the children play in the snow while Daniel worked on repairing the barn. The scene was peaceful now, but she would never forget the lessons they had all learned during those terrifying weeks, when their very survival had hung in the balance. Katie was learning to be a child again, playing with dolls and giggling with her sisters instead of carrying adult responsibilities. Michael had found a balance between protecting his family and allowing himself to be a teenager. Patrick's energy was now channeled into productive activities rather than destructive ones. Twins had developed a confidence that came from knowing they could contribute meaningfully to their family's welfare. Bridget's laughter rang through the house again, and Timothy spoke freely and easily, his voice adding to the constant chatter that filled their home. Even baby Molly seemed to sense the change in the family's dynamics, becoming more adventurous and playful as she felt the security that came from being surrounded by people who would protect her no matter what. And Margaret herself had undergone the most profound transformation of all. The woman who had once been auctioned as damaged goods had become the cornerstone of a family and a leader in her community. She had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed and had learned that a woman's worth had nothing to do with her ability to bear children and everything to do with her capacity to love, protect, and nurture those who needed her. On Christmas Eve, as the family gathered around the tree that Daniel and the boys had cut from their own land, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a desperate woman with no options and no hope. Now she was surrounded by 8 children who called her mama, a husband who valued her partnership, and a community that respected her leadership. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, settling beside her on the parlor sofa as the children played with their simple but treasured gifts. "I was thinking about that sign they hung around my neck at the auction," Margaret replied. "The one that said, 'I was barren, damaged, worthless.'" Daniel's expression darkened at the memory of how she had been treated. "That was the cruelest thing I've ever seen done to another human being." "Maybe," Margaret said thoughtfully, "but maybe it was also the thing that brought me exactly where I needed to be. If I hadn't been labeled as defective, if some other man had bid on me instead of you, I never would have found this family. I never would have discovered who I really was underneath all that pain and shame." She looked around the room at the children who had taught her what real love meant, at the man who had seen her potential when everyone else saw only her flaws, at the home they had all fought to preserve. "I'm not barren," she said quietly. "I'm the mother of 8 children, the wife of a good man, and a member of a community that depends on me. That auction didn't sell me into servitude, it delivered me to the place where I belonged all along." As if sensing her thoughts, Timothy looked up from the wooden horse he was playing with and smiled at her with the innocent joy of a child who felt completely safe and loved. "Mama," he said, the word carrying all the trust and affection that had grown between them, "will you tell us a story?" Margaret smiled back at him, gathering baby Molly into her lap as the other children clustered around her chair. Outside, snow was falling softly over the valley where they had fought for the right to build their lives in peace. Inside, a family that had been forged through loss, tested by danger, and strengthened by love settled in to hear the kind of story that could only be told by someone who had learned that the most valuable things in life were often the ones that couldn't be bought, sold, or auctioned to the highest bidder. Once upon a time, Margaret began, her voice carrying the warmth and confidence of a woman who finally knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. There was a woman who thought she was broken until she discovered that she was exactly what a family needed to become whole. And as she continued the story, surrounded by the children who had given her purpose and the man who had given her a chance, Margaret Brennan knew that sometimes the most beautiful endings were really just the beginning of something even better. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.